Picture it for a moment. A war so vast it spanned from Alaska's frozen tundra to the steaming jungles of the Pacific. Millions of American soldiers were shipped out to places they couldn't have even found on a map before the conflict began. And here's the real twist. When they arrived, there were no barracks waiting, no homes, not even a roof to shield them. Only mud, rain, and relentless weather pounding down. So, how did the U.S. military handle that? They didn't send lumber halfway around the globe. They didn't waste time on elaborate bases. Instead, they came up with one of the strangest yet most ingenious solutions you've probably never considered: the Quonset Hut. A curved, corrugated steel half-cylinder that could be set up almost anywhere, at any time, and keep men alive through the worst conditions. And here's a number that'll stick with you. More than 100,000 of these huts were built during World War II. That's not a misprint. It was an industrial torrent of steel and sweat transformed into homes, hospitals, command centers, even chapels. Imagine landing on a remote Pacific island in 1943 and seeing one of these gleaming arches rise from the dirt in a single day, ready to shelter dozens of troops. It sounds almost like science fiction, but it happened. Here's the surprising part. These huts weren't just stopgap shelters for the military. They represented a quiet revolution in logistics and housing. Think about it. World War II wasn't one only with bullets or tanks. It was one with supply chains, infrastructure, and the ability to keep men warm, fed, and ready to fight. The Germans built fortresses. The Japanese dug into caves. But the Americans? They relied on a transportable, collapsible, nearly indestructible hut. One that could be shipped flat, assembled by a handful of men, and stand firm through a typhoon. It's the kind of advantage you'll never see glamorized in Hollywood war films. But it changed everything. And if you're thinking, it's just a hut, here's why you'll want to keep watching. These things didn't vanish when the fighting stopped. After 1945, they became part of the American landscape, turned into college dorms, roadside diners, makeshift churches, and housing for returning GIs under the GI Bill. Some still stand today, rusted but unyielding. Reminders of an age when America produced war materials at a speed the world had never imagined. So in this video, we'll explore how the Quonset Hut was born, how it spread across the world like wildfire, what life inside one was truly like, and how something designed to be temporary became a lasting symbol of innovation. It's a story forged from steel, sweat, and unshakable American ingenuity. And trust me, after this, you'll never see a half-cylinder the same way again. By late 1941, America was facing a logistical nightmare. The attack on Pearl Harbor had forced the nation into a global war that would require troops in every corner of the planet. Millions of men were preparing to deploy, and each one needed food, water, and shelter. But the problem was obvious. How do you house an army that never stays still? Traditional wooden barracks were slow to build, and shipping heavy materials halfway around the world was simply impossible. The military needed something new, fast, cheap, portable, and strong enough to withstand everything from Arctic blizzards to tropical monsoons. And this urgency wasn't about comfort. Soldiers fighting in North Africa, the Pacific Islands, or the icy reaches of Alaska couldn't afford to be worn down by exposure. A sick or exhausted soldier wasn't just one man lost. He was a weak link in the chain of war. American planners understood they had to solve the shelter crisis before it began costing battles. The real question wasn't if they'd find a fix, but how quickly they could create one. And that's where the Navy stepped in. In early 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy realized it would need portable buildings for its expanding bases. They didn't want flimsy tents that tore in the wind, or wooden huts that rotted in the jungle. What they envisioned was a building that could be boxed up, shipped anywhere, and bolted together with a few basic tools. Something sailors and soldiers could put up in hours instead of weeks. At the time, the military had been experimenting with the Neeson hut, a British World War I design. Created in 1916 by Major Peter Neeson, it was also a curved steel structure used widely in France. But American planners decided it wasn't quite right. They wanted something simpler, stronger, and tailored for mass production in U.S. factories. In short, an Americanized version. That's where Quonset Point, Rhode Island, enters the picture. It was there that the Navy commissioned the first prototype of what would soon be called the Quonset Hut. And the timing couldn't have been better. As the nation geared up for total war in 1941, the race was on to build not just ships and planes, but an entire movable world to house the men who would fight. So, when American troops began shipping out in early 1942, the foundations for their future homes were already in place. What looked like a simple steel arch was, in truth, the answer to one of World War II's toughest logistical puzzles. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't designed to impress. Yet without it, thousands of soldiers would have been left unprotected in the field, exposed not only to enemy fire, but to the brutal punishment of weather and terrain alike. This wasn't merely about architecture, it was about survival itself. And America was about to prove that solving problems like this swiftly and on a massive scale was one of its greatest wartime strengths. When the Navy issued its call in 1941 for a completely new kind of structure, the challenge fell to the architects and engineers of the George A. Fuller Company, working out of the Davisville Naval Construction Battalion Center in Rhode Island. On paper, the assignment looked simple, but in reality, it was enormous. Design a building that was lightweight, inexpensive, could be shipped flat, and could be assembled by untrained men using only the most basic tools. It also needed to withstand everything from searing tropical heat to freezing Arctic cold, and everything in between. The solution they developed was brilliantly straightforward. Picture a half-cylinder made of corrugated steel sheets, curved into a structure roughly 16 feet wide and 36 feet long. That semicircular form wasn't just aesthetic. It gave the hut remarkable strength, allowing wind, rain, and snow to roll off effortlessly. Plywood panels closed off the ends and could be fitted with doors, windows, or vents depending on local climate and use. Inside, the huts could be left bare or insulated, depending on where they were stationed. Each one rested on either a wooden or concrete base, chosen to match the terrain. The first prototypes went up at Quonset Point in mid-1941, the birthplace of the name that would soon become iconic. They weren't stylish, and they weren't comfortable, but they were exactly what the Navy needed. Each unit could be packed into crates compact enough to fit onto ships or aircraft, shipped thousands of miles, and bolted together on site. A crew of just 6 to 8 men could have one standing in a single day. Compared with the weeks required to build traditional wooden barracks, it's easy to see why the Quonset Hut became an instant success. The first model wasn't flawless, however. Those early 16-foot wide huts proved too narrow for many purposes, so engineers quickly expanded the design to 20 feet, and later to 40-foot wide variants. New versions soon appeared for every possible use: barracks, mess halls, offices, hospitals, even chapels. Because of their modular construction, the huts could be connected, lengthened, or reconfigured as needed, a priceless advantage in war zones where conditions changed overnight. By late 1941, the Navy had already placed massive production orders. The final design was approved, and factories began churning out corrugated steel panels by the ton. The Quonset Hut was now rolling off assembly lines, even as the country was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. By the time U.S. troops landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, those huts were already there, ready to house them. It's easy to look back now and assume their creation was inevitable, but it wasn't. They were born out of urgency, a perfect fusion of industrial power and practical ingenuity. Without Quonset Point, without that crucial Navy contract, and without the swift work of those engineers, the Pacific Campaign might have unfolded very differently. The true genius of the Quonset Hut lay in its simplicity: steel arches, plywood ends, and one unspoken promise. No matter where American troops were sent, they'd have a roof over their heads, even if only for a night. Once the design was finalized in 1941, the U.S. didn't merely build Quonset Huts. It mass-produced them in staggering numbers. American industry was already ramping up to build Liberty ships, Sherman tanks, and B-17 bombers. Adding a prefabricated hut to the list might have seemed minor, but it became one of the most prolific wartime products of all. By 1945, more than 100,000 Quonset huts had rolled out of factories, enough to house entire armies. How is that possible? The secret was the same method that powered all American wartime manufacturing: mass production. Factories across the country were retooled to stamp corrugated steel panels, cut plywood ends, and pack kits that included every bolt, washer, and instruction sheet needed. Each hut was shipped as a flat pack kit weighing roughly 5 tons. They could be loaded into Liberty ships alongside jeeps, rations, and ammunition, then delivered anywhere on Earth. The Fuller Company and its partners didn't waste effort on complex blueprints. Every hut was standardized, so workers could assemble them like cars on an assembly line. The dimensions were uniform, the components interchangeable, and the instructions easy to follow. A box of Quonset parts was essentially a giant Lego set for grown men, except these kits built the infrastructure of a global war. The numbers tell the story best. In 1942, the Navy immediately ordered more than 25,000 huts, and production only accelerated from there. Factories in Rhode Island, New Jersey, and eventually across the Midwest ran around the clock. By 1943, entire ships were leaving American ports loaded exclusively with Quonset hut kits, and the men trained to put them together. The pace of production was so intense that huts were sometimes completed before the military even knew exactly where to send them. But the real miracle was how few men it took to build one. 6 or 8 soldiers armed with wrenches and hammers could raise an entire hut in under a day. No cranes, no trained carpenters, no engineers on site. Just manpower, a set of tools, and a box of parts. That kind of speed meant freshly captured islands could be turned into fully functional bases almost overnight. Airstrips suddenly had barracks for pilots, kitchens serving as mess halls, and offices that became command centers. Within days, a patch of untouched jungle could transform into a small city. It's worth looking at how that compared to the enemy. While German troops dug into concrete bunkers and Japanese soldiers hid inside caves, American forces were assembling steel towns that seemed to rise out of the ground in hours. It wasn't glamorous, but it ensured that wherever the U.S. flag appeared, a working base wasn't far behind. By the war's end, the production numbers were staggering, rivaling some of the largest industrial programs of the entire conflict. Quonset huts weren't merely shelters. They became symbols of America's power to outproduce, outsupply, and outbuild every adversary it faced. Sending soldiers overseas was one thing, but giving them ready-made homes waiting inside crates, no matter where they landed, was something else entirely. Living inside a Quonset hut was an experience most American soldiers had never known before. For many, it was their first time far from home, and suddenly, their house was a curved shell of corrugated steel planted on foreign soil. These huts weren't luxurious by any stretch, but compared to a leaky tent that soaked them at night and froze by dawn, they were a blessing. Interiors could be adjusted depending on the front. In the sweltering South Pacific, the huts were often lined with insulation to soften the heat, with mesh screens added to keep out relentless mosquitoes. In colder regions, places like Alaska or Northern Europe, stoves were installed, sometimes at both ends, to keep the cold away. Wooden floors lifted men out of the mud, and makeshift partitions provided a faint sense of privacy. Still, most soldiers remembered the huts as echoing, noisy, and stiflingly hot during the day. But here's the thing. Quonset huts weren't just barracks. Their adaptability made them whatever the military needed them to be. Some were turned into mess halls where hundreds of men queued for rations. Others became field hospitals filled with cots, the air heavy with antiseptic. Many were used as chapels, with rough wooden altars under their curved roofs, where troops sang hymns thousands of miles from home. They also served as command posts, storage depots, classrooms, even makeshift theaters for movie nights. If a task required a roof, a Quonset hut could handle it. A soldier landing on Guadalcanal in 1943 would have seen rows of huts appearing almost overnight, transforming an untouched jungle into a living, breathing military camp. Those huts offered a strange feeling of permanence in landscapes that felt alien and dangerous. They became a symbol of American ingenuity, proof that no matter how far from home you were sent, a sense of structure and order followed. Of course, they had their flaws. The steel walls amplified every raindrop until the noise was deafening. In the tropics, the heat could be unbearable. Ventilation was often poor, and the humidity warped the wooden ends over time. But soldiers adapted. They built makeshift fans, cut out extra windows, and improvised whatever was needed to make life inside bearable. Compared to foxholes or open tents, it was still a massive improvement. Letters home often mentioned the huts, sometimes jokingly, sometimes with complaint, but nearly always with gratitude for having something between them and the storm. As one Marine stationed in the Pacific put it, "She ain't pretty, but she keeps the rain out. That's all a man can ask for." And perhaps most importantly, these huts brought a touch of normalcy to the chaos of war. You could hang your gear on a nail, line up your cot, and feel, if only for a night, that you were no longer at the mercy of the jungle or the desert. For a soldier far from home, that simple comfort meant everything. The Quonset Hut didn't remain confined to American camps. It spread everywhere U.S. troops advanced. Like wildfire, it followed the front lines around the globe. From the beaches of Normandy to the thick jungles of New Guinea, those half-moon shelters became as recognizable as the soldiers who built them. No matter how remote the battlefield, chances were high you'd spot a cluster of huts forming the backbone of an outpost. In the Pacific, they were indispensable. When Marines stormed Tarawa in 1943 or Iwo Jima in 1945, seizing ground was only the first step. Establishing infrastructure was just as critical. The Quonset Hut made that possible almost instantly. Airfields needed control towers, radio stations, weather rooms, and maintenance shops. Instead of waiting weeks for construction, crates were cracked open, steel arches bolted together, and within days, a barren island bristled with life. Some Pacific bases ended up with hundreds of huts arranged like small towns, complete with roads and hand-painted signs. In Europe, their importance was just as great. After D-Day in June 1944, as Allied forces advanced deeper into France, Quonset huts followed close behind. They sprang up across Normandy as temporary hospitals for the wounded, logistics offices, and living quarters for engineers. When winter descended on the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, these huts were used as heated shelters, offering exhausted troops a brief escape from the freezing forests of Belgium. But some of the most remarkable deployments took place in extreme environments. In Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, huts were constructed to endure hurricane-force winds and brutal cold. Meanwhile, in North Africa, they stood in dusty desert camps beneath the scorching sun, where their curved steel roofs reflected heat far better than canvas tents ever could. No matter the setting, one rule remained constant. These flat-packed buildings could be shipped and assembled faster than anything built by traditional methods. Their global reach was astonishing. By 1945, Quonset huts could be found on every continent except Antarctica. Soldiers used to joke that you could always tell where the Americans had been by spotting those silver half-circles gleaming on the horizon. They became unmistakable symbols of U.S. military presence, recognizable even to civilians who had never set foot near a base. And it wasn't only the Americans who relied on them. Through Lend-Lease programs, Allied nations from Britain to Australia, even the Soviet Union, received thousands of Quonset huts for their own operations. They were universal because they worked, and because no other nation had managed to solve the housing problem on such an enormous scale. These huts became so widespread that many soldiers believed they'd stand forever. They turned barren outposts into bustling towns, imposed order on chaos, and gave troops the infrastructure needed to keep fighting far from home. If war could be measured through logistics, then the Quonset hut ranked among America's most overlooked weapons. By the war's end, it didn't matter whether you were stationed on a Pacific atoll, a French farm, or an Arctic outpost. You'd see the same curved roofs outlined against the horizon. They stood as proof that America hadn't just deployed soldiers overseas. It had brought an entire way of life with them. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, most assumed the Quonset Hut would disappear with the war itself. After all, these steel arches were designed as temporary fixes for an emergency, not as lasting structures. But that isn't how things turned out. Instead, they began a second chapter, one that would unexpectedly shape post-war America. The first question was simple: what to do with them all? With over 100,000 built, the U.S. military suddenly found itself with an enormous surplus. Some were dismantled and scrapped, but thousands more were shipped back home or left standing abroad. The timing couldn't have been better. America was facing a massive housing shortage. Millions of GIs were returning from Europe and the Pacific, while the GI Bill triggered a surge in college enrollments. Cities and universities needed housing for veterans and their families, and they needed it immediately. The Quonset Hut became an instant answer. Across the country, entire hut villages appeared on college campuses. At the University of Michigan, returning veterans and their families lived in Quonset communities complete with small kitchens, bedrooms, and even tiny yards. Other schools, including the University of Minnesota, Brown, and UCLA, followed suit. These makeshift neighborhoods weren't elegant, and many wives joked about cooking meals inside their curved barrel kitchens, but they were fast to build, affordable, and infinitely better than having nothing at all. Beyond universities, entire towns began erecting Quonset neighborhoods. Some were turned into churches, diners, even dance halls. Small business owners bought up surplus huts and converted them into workshops, garages, or warehouses. Farmers loved them too, using the huts as barns, tool sheds, and grain storage. For a generation that had endured years of scarcity, these ready-made buildings felt like unexpected blessings, and they didn't remain confined to America. Overseas, the Quonset huts left behind during the war were quickly absorbed into local life. In places such as the Philippines, Guam, and even parts of Europe, people converted them into houses, classrooms, and small shops long after the Americans had gone. What was meant to be temporary became a lasting symbol of endurance and recovery. Of course, they had their flaws. Families often complained about poor insulation, dripping roofs, and the constant groan of metal under wind or rain. Winters were bitterly cold, summers unbearably hot. Still, for many, those huts represented stability in a world still trying to rebuild. They were stepping stones, a roof to sleep under until something more permanent appeared. And the strangest part was that some of them never went away. Through the 1950s and 60s, thousands were still standing, patched with fresh siding, added windows, and layers of new insulation. Even today, original Quonset huts still dot the American landscape, some rusting and forgotten, others still serving as workshops or storage spaces. What began as a wartime solution ended up reshaping civilian life in peacetime. The Quonset Hut became far more than a shelter. It served as a bridge between the destruction of war and the optimism of rebuilding. And like the soldiers who had once lived within them, these huts turned out to be tougher and longer-lived than anyone ever imagined. Even now, nearly 80 years after World War II, the Quonset Hut hasn't disappeared. In fact, it remains a lasting symbol of wartime ingenuity, a reminder of how America's industrial power could tackle problems on a global scale. Drive across parts of the United States today, and you can still spot them. Those half-cylinders of corrugated steel standing stubbornly in fields, on college grounds, or behind old workshops. Some are dented and weathered, others carefully restored. But all of them tell the same story. Built fast, built cheap, built to endure. The legacy of the Quonset Hut goes beyond nostalgia. Architects and historians often view it as a precursor to modern prefabricated housing. The idea of shipping flat-pack kits and assembling them on site is something we now associate with companies like IKEA. But in 1941, America was already doing it on a massive industrial scale. The hut proved that modular design could be efficient and scalable. sparking post-war debates about solving housing shortages through mass-produced homes. For veterans, those huts carried deep emotional meaning. Many remembered them as the backdrop of their wartime days, the place where they wrote letters home, joked with comrades, or collapsed in exhaustion after battle. For civilians, the huts became an oddly familiar part of the scenery. Stretching from Rhode Island to remote Pacific atolls, they came to represent not only military strength but also the American knack for adaptation and resourcefulness. Culturally, the Quonset Hut even earned a kind of legendary status. Artists painted them, filmmakers used them in scenes, and authors referenced them as shorthand for the wartime experience. By the 1950s, they had secured a place in American pop culture, symbolizing both the grit of war and the hope of renewal. In some small towns, people still gather beneath the curved roofs of former surplus huts, now community centers that host dances, meetings, or Sunday services. Yet the story doesn't end there. In the 21st century, architects and DIY builders have rediscovered the Quonset shape for eco-friendly housing and affordable shelter projects. The same principles that worked in 1942, simplicity, strength, and cost efficiency, still hold true today. Some companies even produce updated Quonset-style buildings for farms, garages, and homes, showing that the original idea never truly went out of fashion. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part of all. These huts were meant to be temporary, but like the men who once slept inside them, they endured. They became markers of an entire generation's struggle and resilience, standing as quiet witnesses to the war that reshaped the world. So next time you pass one of those curved steel shells by the roadside, remember, that humble hut once helped win a world war, sheltered soldiers across continents, and later transformed post-war life in ways no one foresaw. In its quiet, unassuming way, the Quonset Hut stands as much a symbol of World War II as the Jeep, the Sherman tank, or the Liberty ship, proof that sometimes the simplest ideas leave the deepest marks.